The Mill Creek didn't have a proper name before we arrived. Not one that mattered to us anyway. It was just another cut in the ancient height of Oregon, a twisting vein of cold, clear water running through timber that had stood for centuries, watching the world change beneath its highest boughs. We called it Mill Creek because that's what we planted there, a company, a relentless saw, and 100 men determined to bring it all down. Spring of 1903 arrived with its usual damp chill, the air thick with the scent of wet earth, resinous pine, and the acrid tang of sawdust. We were men of calloused hands and strong backs, sure of our dominion over these woods, or at least we were sure enough to believe it until the woods started pushing back. The hum of the circular saws was the heartbeat of the place, a constant grinding shriek that drowned out the whispers of the wind in the firs. Steam whistles screamed the start and end of shifts. The crash of falling timber, a regular punctuation mark in the day. My own hands knew the bite of the axe, the pull of the logging chain. I was a logger by trade, Eli Vance, 32 years old, and like most here, I'd come west for the promise of a decent wage. Enough to buy a small patch of land someday, maybe build something more permanent than a bunkhouse. My lean build, weathered hands, and eyes that had seen too many long, hard days in the woods kept me reliable. I spoke plainly, observed more than I pontificated, and carried a quiet pragmatism forged by years of living by my wits. Silas Miller, our foreman, was the bedrock of Mill Creek, a man nearing 50, carved from the same hard wood he sent to the mill. His face was a road map of sun-creased skin permanently set in a grim, no-nonsense expression, framed by a thick, iron-gray beard he kept trimmed sharp. He moved with the solid, deliberate gait of a man who trusted his own 2 feet more than any machine, and he spoke in clipped, practical sentences, rarely wasting a word. Silas ran the Mill Creek operation with an iron fist, his authority unquestioned, earned through decades of back-breaking work and an unshakable belief in human ingenuity and brute force. He believed in sweat and steel, and little else. The first trouble was small, easily dismissed. A saw blade, a massive circular disc designed to chew through ancient timber, found dulled overnight. Not just worn, but the edge gone soft, twisted like it had chewed through stone, or something harder than any metal we knew. Silas looked at the ruined steel, spat tobacco juice into the sawdust. "Laziness," he barked, his voice cutting through the morning chill. "Night crew didn't sharpen right. Costly mistake, boys. Don't let it happen again." He saw it as negligence, a man's failing, not something else. Not yet. It started with the saws, but soon it was more. A logging chain, thick as my wrist, snapped clean through under a load it should have barely noticed. Not a worn link, mind you, but a clean, impossible break, as if severed by something impossibly strong. Then a stack of fresh-cut lumber, 10 feet high and heavy enough to crush a man, found scattered and tossed like kindling, boards splintered, beams thrown clear of their supports. This wasn't nature. This wasn't a rogue branch or a slipping rope. I saw the marks on the wood myself. Deep gouges that weren't from any tool we owned, too wide, too deep. The men were starting to talk, whispers mostly about things in the woods, old stories, things that lived in the dark places between the trees. Silas just spat tobacco juice. "Idle hands," he said, but his eyes kept going to the tree line too. The cold was a different kind that night, not just the weather. Young Billy, barely out of school, sat on a stump near the fire, whittling a bird from a piece of cedar. He was too skinny for this work, but he had a good heart. "Think I'll head back to Portland come winter," he said, not looking up. "My sister writes, says there's work in the cannery." I nodded, turning my coffee cup in my hands. The heat felt good. "Cannery's easier work than this, boy." He smiled, a quick, hopeful thing. "Got a girl there, Mary. We're saving for a place with a garden, not much, just a patch of green." The fire crackled, and the sounds of the night woods pressed in around us, but for a moment the future felt real, warm, and far away from the dark things that had started to stir. The dark things, as Billy called them in his own quiet way, were growing bolder. What began as an occasional ruined saw or snapped chain became a daily occurrence. Freshly sharpened blades, laid out for the next shift, would be found dulled or worse, bent at impossible angles. Steel tools, solid and heavy, looked as though a giant had twisted them into knots. It wasn't just the cutting edge of the mill anymore, it was the very bones of the operation. Logging carts loaded with felled timber would be found derailed and overturned, the logs themselves scattered deep into the undergrowth, too heavy for any man to move without block and tackle. It took entire shifts to clean up the mess, to repair what could be repaired, to lament what was irrevocably destroyed. Silas, for all his stubbornness, was starting to look haggard. The lines on his face deepened. He'd spend hours examining the damage, running his calloused fingers over the impossible bends in steel, the clean, strange breaks in iron. He'd curse under his breath, muttering about sabotage and disgruntled men, but the logic didn't hold. No man, not even a dozen, could bend a cold steel axle like a pretzel. No man could scatter 50 tons of timber like a child throwing sticks. The sheer scale of it, the cold, methodical destruction, defied human explanation. Still, he clung to his pragmatism, to the belief that everything had a human cause, no matter how outlandish. Old Man Finn watched it all from a distance, usually from his usual spot by the communal fire, carving small, intricate wooden figures from pieces of cedar or pine. He was a small, wiry man, with a face like a dried apple, and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the ancient forest itself. He was of local indigenous heritage, quiet, often sitting apart, his clothing practical, homespun, and worn thin. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was in a low, gravelly voice, often in riddles or warnings that the other men, particularly Silas, dismissed as old-world superstitions. "The trees are angry," he murmured one evening, not looking at anyone in particular, just staring into the flickering flames. "You ask too much of them, you take too much. They will take back." Silas just snorted. "The only thing taking anything back, Finn, is a lazy hand, or a bear, and I ain't seen no bear bend a steel beam." Finn just shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed on the fire. "Not a bear, not a man. The forest has its own memory, its own teeth." His words, quiet as they were, hung in the damp air, chilling more than the evening breeze. Most of us just looked away, uncomfortable, but the whispers continued, growing louder in the bunkhouses at night. Men talked of things seen out of the corner of an eye, shadows too tall, movements too swift for deer or wolf. The camp, once a bastion of human noise and activity, began to feel like a small, flickering flame against an encroaching, watchful darkness. Then came the incident with the main steam donkey. The donkey engine was the heart of our operation, a massive steam-powered winch that hauled the biggest logs out of the ravines. Without it, the whole mill ground to a crawl. We arrived one morning to find it ruined, not just damaged, but systematically dismantled. The heavy steel boiler had been pried from its mountings, the thick pipes twisted into grotesque shapes. The massive cable drum, solid iron, was bent like soft lead, its cable unwound and strewn in massive tangled coils through the mud. It was an act of deliberate, impossible destruction, the work of something with power beyond anything known. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't laziness. This was a statement. Silas stood before the wreckage, his jaw tight, his face pale beneath his weathered skin. The usual grim set of his mouth was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. He ran a hand through his beard, then looked up at the towering, silent firs that loomed over the mill, blotting out the morning light. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something new in his eyes, not just anger, but a profound, chilling bewilderment. His world, built on tangible facts and hard work, was crumbling around him. The sounds of the mill, usually a relentless symphony, were muted, replaced by the stunned silence of 100 men staring at the impossible. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the men, his voice low, almost a growl, but without its usual conviction. "This ain't right," he said, the words tasting bitter. "This ain't natural." He paused, took a deep breath that sounded more like a shudder. "We can't let this go on. We can't work like this. We need to know what's out there." The admission was a surrender, a crack in his staunch pragmatism. He looked at us, his eyes hard once more, but with a new desperation. "We'll set watches, armed watches, 3 men to a shift, patrolling the perimeter, keeping an eye on the equipment. We'll find out what's doing this, and we'll put a stop to it." The words were meant to inspire confidence, but they only solidified the fear. Silas had finally acknowledged the unseen, the unexplainable. The very act of arming ourselves against an unknown enemy, one that could bend steel and toss timber, was an admission of how deeply we were losing control. The Mill Creek Lumber Company, once a symbol of man's dominion, now felt like a desperate, isolated outpost, surrounded by a wilderness that had decided with terrifying certainty that it was time to push back. And we were going to stand watch, waiting for it to show itself. We were going to stand watch, waiting for it to show itself. The camp changed overnight. The usual boisterous laughter died down. Men spoke in hushed tones, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line, even in broad daylight. The night watches began. 3 men assigned to shifts, rifles at the ready, patrolling the perimeter of the mill, an invisible boundary we hoped would keep the unknown out. It was a fool's hope, but it was all Silas had left to offer. I was assigned to the second watch from midnight to 4 in the morning, along with Tommy O'Malley and Big John. Tommy, usually full of bluster, was quieter than I'd ever seen him. His usual booming laugh was replaced by nervous coughs. Big John, as always, was a rock, his massive frame moving with a quiet determination, his rifle held steady. He didn't say much, but his presence was a comfort, a solid anchor against the creeping unease. The nights became a different kind of beast. The forest, once a backdrop of familiar sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a coyote, now felt like a living, breathing entity pressing in on us. The sounds were muted or altogether absent. Sometimes a branch would snap with an unnatural, sharp crack, far too loud for a deer, too deliberate for the wind. We'd freeze, straining our ears, but the sound would never repeat itself. Just silence. A silence that felt heavy, pregnant with something unseen. The fog, thick and cold, often rolled in from the Pacific, cloaking the mill in a shroud, turning familiar shapes into monstrous shadows. It made the watch feel less like protection and more like blind men fumbling in the dark. The sabotage didn't stop. If anything, it grew more precise, more personal. We'd find our patrols had been watched. A length of rope, freshly coiled and left by a sawhorse, would be found frayed and cut, not with a blade, but torn clean through as if by immense ragged claws. A heavy iron pry bar left near a stack of logs would be found driven deep into the earth, bent into a hook. It was a message delivered with impossible strength. Impossible. It was telling us it knew we were there. It was telling us it didn't care. One night, the cold bit hard. Tommy, John, and I were making our rounds near the furthest logging cart track, where a fresh delivery of pine had been left for the morning shift. The moon was a sliver, mostly hidden by clouds, but it cast enough light to see the rough track ahead. We rounded a bend, and the air went colder. The logging cart, a heavy steel-reinforced platform on the thick wooden wheels, lay on its side like a toy tossed by a child. The dozen massive logs it had carried were scattered, some driven into the soft earth, others splintered against nearby trees. This was beyond anything we'd seen before. The cart itself, designed to carry tons, had been ripped from its axles. One of the axles, thick as my thigh, was twisted into a corkscrew. Tommy let out a low whistle, a sound of genuine awe and terror. "Lord above," he whispered, his voice thin in the cold air. "What in hell's name?" John knelt, examining the wreckage. He ran his hand over the bent steel, his brow furrowed. He picked up a splintered piece of pine, a log that had been clean broken in half, and shook his head. His eyes, usually so calm, held a bewildered fear. Then I saw it. Just beyond the overturned cart, where the ground was softer, muddier from the recent rains. A depression, not a boot print, not a hoof print. It was long, impossibly long and wide. I knelt, my breath catching in my throat, and placed my hand next to it. My hand, even with my fingers outstretched, was dwarfed. The print was a good 18 inches, maybe more, pressed deep into the mud, a clear impression of 5 toes, broad and distinct. Not human, not bare. Something else, something immense. "Look," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Tommy and John came closer, their rifles forgotten for a moment. Tommy's face, usually ruddy, was pale in the dim light. He stared at the print, then at me, then back at the print. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, the bravado completely stripped away. That ain't possible." John just stared, his mouth a grim line. He didn't need to say anything. The print spoke for itself. It was the undeniable proof. The monster of the woods wasn't a legend anymore. It was real, and it was here. We stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into our bones, the fear seeping into our very souls. The mill, with its comforting sounds, felt miles away. The silence of the forest pressed in, no longer just unnerving, but predatory. We didn't know what to do. We just knew we had seen something that defied all reason, all understanding. We looked at each other, 3 men suddenly very small, very vulnerable. When we returned to the camp, the sun was just beginning to streak the sky with gray. Silas met us, his face drawn. He took one look at our faces, then at the print we'd scraped into the mud with a stick. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, looking at that crude drawing, a grim acceptance settling over his features. Even his stubborn pragmatism couldn't deny the impossible anymore. Old Man Finn, who had been sitting by the dying fire carving a small wooden owl, merely looked up at us, his ancient eyes holding a sorrowful, knowing gaze. He didn't speak, but his silence was louder than any of Silas's curses. It said, "I told you so." The next few days were a blur of nervous activity. Silas doubled the watches, but what good were more men against something that left such marks? The fear was a living thing in the camp now, palpable, heavy. Men whispered less and started packing their meager belongings. Some talked of leaving, but the nearest town was days away through the very woods that held this thing, and who would believe us? Who would come to help? Our shifts continued. The forest watched. We felt it. The air was always heavy with unseen presence. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow became a potential threat. We slept fitfully, if at all, haunted by the image of that monstrous footprint. Then came the night. It was a clear night, the moon a brilliant full orb casting long, stark shadows. Too clear. We were on watch again, Eli, Tommy, and John patrolling the far eastern edge of the mill, near a small clearing where a pile of newly cut timber lay. The air was still, unnaturally so. Not a breath of wind stirred the tall firs. The only sound was the crunch of our boots on the damp earth. "Too quiet," Tommy whispered, his rifle held tight against his chest, his eyes wide and darting. "Don't like it." John nodded, his heavy breathing the only other sound. I felt it too, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The kind of feeling you get when you're being watched, not by an animal, but by something with intelligence. Something that was waiting. We moved slowly, deliberately, our eyes straining against the deep shadows cast by the moon. The clearing opened up before us, bathed in the pale silver light. The stack of timber, a pyramid of raw, stripped logs, gleamed faintly. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, from the edge of the clearing, where the deepest shadows pooled, I saw it. A movement. A ripple in the darkness that was too large, too deliberate to be a trick of the light. My heart hammered against my ribs. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking slightly. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Tommy and John had stopped dead, their gazes fixed on the same spot. John raised his rifle too, slowly, deliberately. A sound then, not a growl, not a roar, a soft, guttural thump, like a massive fist hitting soft earth. Then another, and another. It was coming closer, moving through the underbrush with impossible silence for something of its size. A figure emerged from the deep shadows, stepping into the edge of the moonlight. It was massive. Taller than any man, easily 8 feet, perhaps more. Its form was hulking, broad-shouldered, and covered in shaggy, dark hair that seemed to absorb the moonlight. It wasn't quite human, not quite ape. It stood with a slight stoop, its head low, but the sheer scale of it was terrifying. Its arms hung long, almost to its knees, thick with muscle. We stood frozen, rifles raised, but useless. What could a rifle do against something like that? It paused, its head slowly turning as if sensing us, its eyes, if it had them, lost in the shadows of its brow. Then it moved, not towards us directly, but towards the stack of timber. With a casual, terrifying ease, it reached out a massive, hairy hand and simply pulled a log that weighed hundreds of pounds, from the bottom of the stack. The whole pile shuddered, threatening to collapse. It tossed the log aside as if it were kindling, the sound of its landing a dull thud. It was methodical. It was deliberate. It was showing us its strength. "Run!" I shouted, the word torn from my throat. It was a stupid command. Where would we run? But the primal urge to flee, to survive, overwhelmed everything else. Tommy, bless his panicked heart, turned and bolted. He didn't run for cover, didn't run for the trees. He ran back the way we had come, out into the open clearing, a clear target against the moonlit ground. The creature's head snapped up. It saw him. It moved with a sudden, horrifying burst of speed, covering the distance in only a few impossibly long strides. It was faster than a man could imagine, silent as a ghost. Tommy screamed, a raw, piercing sound that cut through the still night. The creature reached him in an instant, its massive hand, disproportionately large, wrapped around Tommy's chest, lifting him effortlessly from the ground. Tommy thrashed, his rifle falling uselessly to the earth, but he was like a doll in its grip. He screamed again, a gurgling, desperate sound, as he was dragged back towards the deep shadows of the forest, away from the moonlight. John and I stood paralyzed, our rifles still raised, but our fingers frozen on the triggers. We watched, helpless, as Tommy O'Malley, the loud, boisterous man who had always been the first to laugh, disappeared into the darkness. His screams, gut-wrenching and full of terror, were abruptly, chillingly cut short, a final choked gasp, then silence. A silence more profound, more terrifying than any before. The monster was gone. Tommy was gone. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart, and John's ragged breathing beside me. We stood there, shaking, staring at the empty space where Tommy had been. There was no body, no struggle, just the lingering echo of a scream that had been brutally, undeniably silenced. Our worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't sabotage. This was murder. And we were next. John and I didn't speak. We couldn't. The sounds of the forest, which had been so unnaturally quiet, now seemed to press in on us with 1,000 unseen eyes. The echo of Tommy's final scream was a phantom in the air, a stain on the night. We stood for what felt like an eternity, rifles still uselessly raised before the cold dread finally propelled us. We turned, not running, but moving with a desperate, broken stumble back towards the distant lights of the mill. Silas was waiting by the main gate, a lantern casting his face in stark relief. He saw us approach, two ghosts in the moonlight, and his eyes, usually so hard and commanding, were filled with a terrible, dawning understanding. We didn't need to speak. The empty space where Tommy should have been, the look on our faces, told him everything. He just nodded, a slow, grim dip of his head, and motioned us inside. The gate clanged shut behind us, a futile barrier against the vast, patient darkness. Tommy's disappearance wasn't just a loss. It was a wound ripped through the camp. The whispers stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. Men moved with a new kind of fear, not just unease, but a primal, desperate terror. Silas, for all his iron will, seemed to shrink. He still gave orders, still tried to organize the remaining men, but his voice lacked its usual force. His eyes, perpetually scanning the tree line, were haunted. His authority, once absolute, now felt like a thin veneer over a crumbling dam. No one blamed him, not really. What could any man do against a thing that could pluck a fully grown man from the earth and silence him without a trace? The creature, emboldened by its victory, seemed to shed its caution. The sabotage, which had been its calling card, faded. It was no longer interested in breaking our machines. It was interested in breaking us. The attacks became bolder, more direct. Rocks, heavy and jagged, would crash onto the corrugated iron roofs of our bunkhouses in the dead of night, shaking the very foundations. Massive branches, snapped clean from trees that must have stood for centuries, would be hurled into the clearings, landing with deafening thuds that made men jump from their beds, rifles in hand, hearts pounding. It was a constant psychological assault, a reminder that it was out there, always watching, always near. We were trapped in a cage, and the bars were made of fear. The most pressing concern became escape. Silas, despite his outward resolve, knew we couldn't stay. He tried to organize a party to ride for help, to reach the nearest settlement, a desperate gamble through the monster's territory. 3 of our best horses, strong and fast, were readied, but the creature seemed to anticipate every move. The next morning we found them, not just scattered or driven off. They were mutilated, their bodies torn and broken, left as a gruesome warning right at the edge of the camp clearing. No man, no beast could have done that. It was too precise in its cruelty, too deliberate in its message. You are not leaving this place. The supplies were next. Our food stores, lumber, tools, anything not locked tight within the main mill building began to vanish or be destroyed. Barrels of flour were found ripped open, their contents scattered and ruined. Axes left carelessly outside were bent into impossible shapes, their steel twisted like wire. It was as if the creature was systematically dismantling our ability to survive piece by piece, isolating us completely. The nearest town, once just days away, now felt like another world, unreachable, a dream. The men huddled closer, forming small, desperate knots. There was no more laughter, no more card games, just the low murmur of fearful voices or the unnerving silence. Our numbers, once 100 strong, now felt pitifully small. We were always counting heads, always checking for missing faces. Sleep was a luxury few could afford, haunted by the memory of Tommy's scream, the sight of the mutilated horses, and the constant unnerving sounds of the creature moving just beyond the reach of our lanterns. Old Man Finn, who had been a quiet observer, now found his words carrying a terrible weight. He sat by the fire, carving his small wooden figures, his eyes often fixed on the darkening woods. He didn't say, "I told you so," not in words, but his quiet predictions of the land pushing back had come true with a vengeance. He spoke of ancient spirits, of a balance disturbed, of a reckoning. Silas, who would have scoffed months ago, now listened, a grim respect in his eyes. Eli and Big John, always steady, found themselves the de facto leaders of the remaining men, working to maintain some semblance of order to ration what little we had left. John, especially, was a rock. His quiet strength was a comfort, a reminder that some men at least would not break easily. He still talked, in hushed tones, of saving enough for his sister, but the hope in his voice was thinning, like ice in spring. One afternoon, the foreman called us together. Our dwindling supply of kerosene, essential for lamps and the remaining small generators, was almost gone. We had a reserve, a good store of it, but it was in the old storage shed. The shed was not within the main fortified compound, but stood 100 yards outside, nestled against the tree line, a relic from the early days of the mill. It was a stout building, made of thick planks, but now it felt like a death trap. Going out there was a suicide mission. "We need that kerosene," Silas said, his voice flat, his gaze sweeping over our faces. "Without it, we'll be in the dark within 2 days, and in the dark, we're blind." No one volunteered. The air was thick with unspoken fear. Every man knew what lay outside the gate. "I'll go," Big John said, his voice deep and steady. He picked up his axe, testing its weight. "Need someone to carry the cans anyway. You coming, Eli?" I nodded. John was right. Someone had to. And if anyone could stand a chance against that thing, it was John. His strength was legendary, his resolve unshakable. We gathered a small group. John and I and 2 other men, young Thomas and another called Miller, both armed with rifles, their faces pale with terror. Our plan was simple. Move fast, get in, get the kerosene, and get out. The walk to the shed felt like miles, though it was only 100 yards. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every rustle of leaves was the monster moving in for the kill. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the smell of pine and fear. We moved in a tight formation, rifles raised, eyes darting. The shed loomed ahead, a dark shape against the encroaching twilight, its wooden walls seemingly intact. No signs of forced entry. A good sign, we hoped. John took the lead, his massive frame a shield. He reached the shed door, his hand on the latch. It was stiff, rusted. He pulled hard, and the old hinges groaned. The door swung inward with a shriek of tortured metal, revealing the dim interior, smelling of dust and oil. "All clear," John rumbled, stepping inside. Thomas and Miller fanned out, covering the perimeter, their rifles trembling in their hands. I followed John into the shed, my rifle held ready. The kerosene cans were stacked against the far wall, glinting faintly in the fading light. John began to heft them 2 at a time, his powerful arms making light work of the heavy containers. We had almost finished loading the last of the cans when a sound, like a tree trunk snapping, erupted from inside the shed. Not from outside. My blood ran cold. Before I could even turn, a massive, hairy arm, thick as a man's torso, shot out from the shadows in the back corner of the shed. It wasn't empty. It held Thomas, lifted effortlessly, his mouth open in a silent scream. The creature, which must have been waiting in the dark, had been right there, hidden in plain sight. "John," I yelled, my rifle coming up. But it was too late. Thomas was slammed against the wooden wall with sickening force, his body crumpling like a discarded rag. The creature, a hulking mass of shadow and fur, emerged fully, impossibly large within the cramped space. It was the same one we had seen before, its size filling the shed, its presence radiating a cold, ancient fury. John roared. It was a sound of pure defiance, of animal rage. He didn't hesitate. He dropped the kerosene cans, the metal clanging loudly on the wooden floor, and swung his axe. The blade meant for felling ancient trees connected with a dull thud against the creature's shoulder. It was a solid hit, enough to cleave a lesser man in two, but the monster barely flinched. The axe seemed to bounce off its massive form, a futile gesture against its raw, unyielding power. The creature turned its massive head, its eyes, deep-set and dark, fixing on John. It was a gaze that promised death. It reached out, its hand like a clawed vice, and grabbed John's axe arm. John struggled, his muscles bulging, his feet scrabbling for purchase on the dusty floor, but he was losing. Even Big John, with all his immense strength, was no match. "Run, Eli!" he bellowed. His voice choked with effort, his eyes wide with a desperate plea. "Get out!" Outside, Miller fired his rifle, the shot echoing hollowly, but it was a useless effort. The creature ignored him. It wrenched John's axe from his grasp, tossing it aside like a toy. Then, with a terrifying, deliberate slowness, it lifted John from the ground. John thrashed, his legs kicking, his hands clawing at the massive arm wrapped around him. He screamed, a guttural, terrifying sound, not of pain, but of sheer, unadulterated terror. I stood frozen, rifle useless in my hands, witnessing the impossible. My mind screamed at me to act, to shoot. But what good would it do? I had seen what happened to Tommy. I watched as the creature, with a terrifying display of its power, simply crushed John. A sickening crack, like dry branches under a boot, rent the air. John's scream cut off, abruptly, horribly. His body went limp, a broken marionette in the monster's grasp. The creature held him for a moment longer, then casually tossed his lifeless form into the deepest shadows of the shed, as if discarding a broken doll. It then turned its head slowly, its dark gaze finding me. There was no rage in those eyes, no triumph, just a chilling, predatory intelligence. It knew, it understood. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I dropped my rifle. There was no fighting this. There was only flight. I turned and ran, bursting out of the shed, past a whimpering Miller who was still firing aimlessly into the trees. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The sounds of the creature moving within the shed, the muffled thud as it stepped over John's body, echoed in my mind. I didn't stop until I stumbled through the main gate of the mill, gasping for breath, my lungs burning, my body shaking uncontrollably. Silas and the others rushed to me, their faces full of questions I couldn't answer. All I could do was point back towards the darkness, towards the shed, towards the silence where John and Thomas had been. Big John, the strongest among us, was gone, crushed like an insect. We had seen it. We had felt the earth shake with its power. The creature was not just intelligent, it was a force of nature, a vengeful spirit of the woods given flesh. Our guns were useless, our strength was useless, our hope was gone. Silas looked at me, then at the terrified faces of the men. His last vestiges of authority, of command, finally shattered. He slumped against a stack of timber, his face in his hands. The realization hit us all, cold and brutal. We were trapped. We were hunted. The mill, our fortress, was a tomb. There was no more defense. There was no more standing our ground. Our only option, our last desperate gamble, was to abandon everything and run, not to fight, but to flee, to somehow make our way through the creature's territory, through the ancient, unforgiving woods, and hope, against all odds, to escape it entirely. The forest had won. The forest had won. Silas, broken, didn't argue. There was nothing left to defend. We gathered what we could, a few tins of hardtack, a flask of whiskey, a couple of blankets, and the remaining rifles, though we knew they were mostly useless. Our numbers were few. Myself, Silas, Old Man Finn, and young Billy. 4 men against the ancient woods and the thing that claimed it. Leaving the mill felt like tearing off a limb. The place we had built, the noisy, steaming heart of our ambition, was now a silent, gaping maw in the darkness. We didn't light lanterns, didn't dare. Old Man Finn took the lead, his wiry frame seeming to melt into the shadows. He knew these woods, had walked them before we ever cut a single tree. His eyes, even in the gloom, seemed to see more than ours. He moved with a quiet certainty, picking paths that twisted through dense undergrowth, avoiding the familiar logging trails we'd carved. Those were the creature's hunting grounds now. The silence of the forest pressed in, no crickets, no rustling of small game. Just the hollow thud of our boots on damp earth and the ragged sound of our breathing. Every snapped twig, every drip of water from a fern was amplified, a potential signal of pursuit. Fear was a cold hand gripping my throat, making every swallow an effort. We walked for hours, or what felt like hours. Time lost its meaning in the perpetual twilight beneath the ancient canopy. The trees loomed, black and skeletal, their branches interwoven so tightly they blotted out the sliver of moon. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of damp earth and rot. Billy, thin and pale, stumbled often, his youthful hope replaced by a wide-eyed terror that mirrored my own. Silas, usually so solid, moved with a defeated slump to his shoulders, his jaw set in a grim line that couldn't hide the tremor in his hands. Old Man Finn, without a word, would occasionally pause, his head cocked, listening to something we couldn't hear, then change direction, a subtle shift in course that told us the monster was near, or had been near. He was guiding us, not away from the forest, but through it, trying to navigate a path that might lead us out, or perhaps just to another part of its vast, indifferent territory. Daybreak came, not with a burst of light, but a gradual lightening of the oppressive gloom. The forest remained a place of shadows, but the shapes were clearer now. We found a small, hidden alcove beneath a tangle of roots and vines, a place Finn seemed to know, and rested. Chewed on hardtack that tasted like dust. Drank from the flask, the whiskey burning a brief, false warmth in our bellies. "It knows we're here," Silas rasped, his voice raw. He stared into the green-black gloom beyond our makeshift shelter. "It's playing with us." Finn nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "It owns this land. We are trespassers. It will teach us." His words were soft, but they carried the weight of ages. We tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of timber was the creature. We pushed on when the light was strongest, trying to put as much distance as we could between us and the mill, between us and the thing that hunted us. The second day blurred into the third. Our supplies dwindled. The hardtack was gone. The whiskey, too. We ate berries, Finn pointed out, sour and meager. Thirst was a constant ache. Our clothes were torn, our faces scratched by branches, our bodies aching with exhaustion. Billy's cough grew worse, a wet, hacking sound that we all tried to ignore but couldn't. The monster didn't show itself, not directly, but its presence was a suffocating shroud. We'd find signs. A massive tree freshly snapped in half lying across our intended path, an impossible barrier, or a patch of ground where the moss was torn up, revealing the churned earth beneath, and there unmistakable the 18-inch footprints, deep and clear. It was always just behind us, always watching, always pushing us. It was a cruel, patient game. One afternoon, as the perpetual twilight of the deep woods began to deepen further into true dusk, we came upon a small, swift-flowing creek. We desperately needed water. Finn, ever cautious, held us back. He knelt by the bank, examining the mud. His finger traced something, then he looked up, his eyes grave. "Not safe," he whispered. "It was here, not long ago." But Billy, his thirst overwhelming, stumbled forward, ignoring the warning. He knelt, cupping his hands, splashing water on his face. He drank deeply, then looked back at us, a fleeting, desperate smile on his lips. "It's cold," he whispered, his voice hoarse. That's when the scream came. Not Billy's. It was a sound that tore through the quiet, a guttural roar from the creature, not of warning, but of pure, unadulterated fury. It wasn't directly at us, but from the dense thicket just across the creek, closer than it had been in days. It was a sound that shook the very ground beneath our feet. Billy dropped his head into his hands, sobbing, a broken, terrified sound. "It's going to get us," he whimpered. "It's going to get us all." His fear was a contagion. Silas gripped his rifle, his knuckles white, his eyes darting wildly. Finn pointed, his voice low and urgent. "That way, up the ridge, faster." But the ridge was steep, choked with fallen timber and thickets of thorny bushes. It would slow us down, make us easy targets. The monster's roar faded into a series of heavy, purposeful thuds in the distance, getting closer. "We can't go that way," Silas argued, his voice cracking. "Too slow." "It knows the easy paths," Finn countered, his gaze unwavering. "It waits there." The creature's thuds grew louder, closer. It was circling, cutting us off. We were caught between the creek, the impossible ridge, and the unseen terror that stalked us. My mind, numb with exhaustion and fear, suddenly saw a horrifying clarity. A choice, stark and brutal, presented itself. If we all tried to climb the ridge, we would be too slow. The creature would pick us off one by one like it had John and Thomas, but if one of us created a diversion, drew its attention, the others might have a chance. My eyes fell on Billy. Frail, coughing, stumbling. He was the slowest, the most vulnerable, the most scared, and he was the one who had spoken of Mary, of the cannery, of a small patch of green, a future I knew with a sickening certainty he would never see. The thuds were very close now. We could hear the heavy breathing, the rustle of massive bulk through the undergrowth. A shadow, impossibly tall, flickered between the trees. "Silas," I said, my voice flat, almost emotionless, "take Finn. Go up the ridge. Now, as fast as you can." Silas stared at me, his eyes wide with a dawning comprehension. He knew what I was asking. He knew what I meant. "Eli, no," he started, but I cut him off. "This is our only chance. Go." I pushed my rifle into his hands. It was heavy, useless. I didn't have a plan, not really. Just a desperate, animalistic urge to buy them time. I grabbed a thick, broken branch from the ground, heavy as a club. I looked at Billy. His eyes were huge, filled with a primal, innocent terror. He understood too. The tears streamed down his face. "Billy," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Mary, tell her." I couldn't finish the sentence. There was nothing to tell, no lie to offer. Silas grabbed Finn, pulling him roughly towards the ridge. Finn looked back at me, his ancient eyes filled with a sorrowful understanding, a resignation to the ways of men and the power of the forest. He didn't protest. He just went. I turned back to face the approaching darkness. The creature was there, a hulking mass, a moving wall of dark fur. It stepped into a patch of filtered light, its size overwhelming, its form vaguely humanoid but wrong, so very wrong. Its head, massive and low-slung, turned to me, its eyes, deep-set and dark, fixed on mine. There was no fury there now, only a cold, ancient intelligence, a knowing. I roared, a broken, desperate sound, more animal than human. I swung the branch. Not at the creature, but at the undergrowth to my right, creating a crashing, thrashing sound, trying to draw its attention away from the ridge. The creature didn't move. It just watched me. Then, with a chillingly deliberate slowness, it turned its head towards the ridge where Silas and Finn were scrambling upwards, their heavy breaths audible even from here. It wasn't fooled. Not for a moment. My heart seized. It had seen. It knew. Then, the creature looked back at me, and for the first time, I saw something in its eyes that wasn't just intelligence, but a flicker of something almost akin to satisfaction. It raised a massive arm, not in attack, but in a gesture, a slow, deliberate swing of its hand, pointing. Not at me, but towards the ridge, towards Billy. Billy, seeing the gesture, let out a choked cry. He knew too. The monster was making its choice. Not me. Not the one offering the fight, but the weakest. The one with hope. The creature moved then, not towards me, but with a terrifying burst of speed, it lunged towards the base of the ridge. I screamed a useless, pathetic sound and tried to follow, but it was too fast. It was a dark blur, a force of nature. I heard Billy scream then, not a whimpering cry, but a raw, agonizing shriek that tore through the forest, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror and pain. It was cut short, abruptly, horribly, just like Tommy's. A sickening crunch followed, a sound that would echo in my nightmares for the rest of my days. Then, silence. A profound, absolute silence that was worse than any scream. I stood there, paralyzed, the heavy branch still in my hands, listening to the echoes of that final, terrible sound. The creature was gone. Billy was gone. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. I had sent him. I had made the choice. His life for ours, his dreams for our escape. I didn't know how long I stood there. It could have been minutes, an hour, and my body shook, not from cold, but from the horror of what I had witnessed, what I had done. Finally, mechanically, I forced myself to move. I looked towards the ridge. Silas and Finn were gone. They had made it. For now. I stumbled after them, my mind a fog of grief and terror. I didn't see the monster again. Its work was done. It had made its point. I walked for what felt like eternity. The forest seemed to mock me with its indifferent beauty. The trees, once majestic, were now just silent, towering witnesses to my failure. I don't know when I lost Finn. He was just there, and then he wasn't. Perhaps he peeled off, chose to stay, to return to the land he understood. Perhaps the monster took him silently, just as it had taken the others. I never saw him again. He was another ghost in the endless green labyrinth. Eventually, when I thought my legs would give out and my heart would simply stop, I saw it. A faint glimmer through the trees. Not the deep, primal darkness of the old growth, but a lighter, more familiar green. Then a thin line of blue. Sky. Open sky. I pushed through the last tangle of ferns, stumbled over a moss-covered log, and fell onto a dirt path. A road. A real road. And beyond it, a field. And in the distance, a wisp of smoke from a chimney. Civilization. Silas was there, slumped against a tree, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He looked ancient, broken. His rifle lay discarded beside him. He looked up as I stumbled out, his eyes hollow. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. We had escaped. But the cost? The cost was everything. We made it to the nearest settlement, a small logging town a few days' walk from our abandoned mill. We told our story. The monster, the sabotage, the deaths. Tommy, Big John, young Billy, Finn, the authorities, men in clean clothes and stiff collars, listened with polite disbelief. They spoke of bears, of renegade prospectors, of shared hallucinations brought on by starvation and fear. They wrote it off as the ravings of traumatized men, of desperate loggers who had lost their minds in the wilderness. No one went back to Mill Creek. Not officially. The Mill Creek Lumber Company, once a beacon of industry, simply ceased to exist. Its equipment, its structures, its very memory were left to the forest. I heard years later that the main mill building had collapsed, swallowed by vines and moss, its saws rusting into oblivion, its once proud smokestack a broken tooth against the sky. The forest reclaimed what was always its own. I never went back to the woods. Not for logging, not for anything. I tried other work in other towns far from the towering trees and the whispers of the wild. I tried to build a new life, but the memory was a shadow that never left my side. The smell of pines still brought a cold sweat to my brow. The sound of a branch snapping in the wind still made me flinch. I am an old man now. The years have softened the edges of my grief, but not the indelible mark of that primal fear. I still see Billy's face, his wide, terrified eyes, his last scream. I still hear the crunch, and I know what lives in those deep, ancient woods. It is there still, I am certain, patient, watching. A silent, permanent guardian of the land, waiting for the next encroachment, for the next man foolish enough to believe he can conquer the wilderness, the Mill Creek monster. They called it a legend, but I lived it, and I know the truth. Some things are not meant to be disturbed. Some victories belong to the wild, and some debts once paid in blood are never truly settled.